and not in our tawakkul has to be in musabbibul asbab and not in the sabab. Let me repeat that. Our tawakkul must be in musabbibul asbab, that's Allah. That means the one who causes the cause, and not in the sabab or the cause itself. If our tawakkul is put into the cause rather than the one who causes the cause, then this is a type of shirk. It's called minor shirk generally, and there are many examples that are given. It's like when you're sick and going to the doctor, your tawakkul is in Allah, but then you realize Allah has given this doctor the tools, the mechanism, the knowledge that I don't have. I have to go to the doctor, but it is Allah who will bring the shifa and not the doctor or the medicine that will itself, in and of itself, cause shifa. So if you put your tawakkul in the sabab, this is not going to get you to the end result. This is a very important point in all of our affairs of life. Your job, your degree, your education, your qualifications, all of this is a sabab. Allah has given it to you. You put your tawakkul in that, then this is a type of shirk, and it will not bring us success.
For the youth, for those of you who are still living at home, for those of you who still have to face what you consider the stifling experience of the rules that your parents place upon you, and all of these issues of clashing with them, I want to remind you, point number one, I want to remind you of a simple fact. It is a fact that has nothing to do with our religion. It is a fact that transcends culture and civilization. It is a human fact. And that fact is, no one on earth will ever love you as much as your parents. And no one cares more about you than your parents. And whether you understand it or not, your parents have your best interest in mind when they tell you what they want you to do. Now I know this fact is somewhere back there, you know it. But wallahi, I know as a teenager, you didn't even want to think about it. You just want to sideline it. You know it deep down, you know it. And this is just words to you now. And mark my words and remember them. Until you are a parent, you will never understand what this means. Until you have a child of your own. Until you hold this little baby in your arms. And as a mother or a father, you realize, oh my God, I'm in charge of this kid. I have to take care of this kid. And then those emotions start coming in. And then you begin to sacrifice your sleep, your time, and your effort, and your money, and the love for this child grows and grows and grows. Then it hits you. Then and only then. Right now it's only words. Then it will hit you. Oh my God, my parents must have been through the same thing that I'm going through now. And you know what you're going to feel? I felt this, and I know all of you that are going to have kids and have kids feel this. You will feel an immense sense of guilt. Guilt. When you have your child, and you start to sacrifice for that child, then and only then will you realize, what did I do? How could I have treated my parents like that? What if this kid does the same to me? Because the kid will do the same to you eventually. It's a part of human dynamics. But my point to you is very simple. And that is, Allah Azza wa Jal, in His infinite plan of creation, has placed in the parents this emotion without which, wallahi, they could not raise kids. Kids are not easy to raise. Do you know the amount of frustration that builds in a parent because of the child? Only a parent knows this. Do you know the amount of money that you have to spend to raise a kid? All of that money, the parents, their lives become transformed after they have kids. Their lives become for their kids. They live for their children. And that's something, you know it, as kids you know it, but it never really hits you. And you won't experience it until you're a parent on your own. I want you to understand that this asphyxiation you have, wallahi, it is an asphyxiation of love. It's because your parents love you, they're placing all these commands on you. You might think that you know better than them. Most of the time you don't. Sometimes, yes, you do, no doubt. But most of the time you don't. No one on earth will ever love you as much as your parents.
Many youth think that the only way to benefit Islam is through academic. Or the only way that I can do something is become a superstar da'i and go to Azhar or go to Medina or go to University of such and such and finish my PhD. But not everybody is cut out to be a scholar. And in fact, the majority of the Sahaba were not scholars in that sense. The majority of the Sahaba were not narrators of hadith. The majority of the Sahaba were not masters of halal and haram. And yet they were all occupying a very high rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think this is one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings that pious youth have. Of course, we have many types of youth. The righteous youth, they think that the only thing I can do to benefit Islam is to dedicate my life to academics. But then things happen. Parents need you. You have to get married. You get a job. And then somehow most people can't go and study academic Islam. And therefore, they start living a very lackadaisical life, a very un-Islamic, maybe even nothing much to do with Islam, because they thought, well, I wasn't able to go to Azhar, I wasn't able to go to University of Medina, I might as well just live a mediocre life. What my advice to them is, look, if you can't become a scholar, that doesn't mean you can't do anything for Islam. Wallahi, scholars need non-scholars. Scholars need scholars in other fields. If you can't be a scholar of Islam, become a scholar of something else. Even if it's a scholar of social work, a scholar of building a masjid. Do something productive and practical that Allah has blessed you with, and believe you me, every one of us has a role to play in that. Some of the roles are more public than others, but that doesn't mean that those roles are necessarily better in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahi, there are millions of people, they are doing jobs in the sight of Allah, they are far better than those in the public eye, and they will get rewarded more because there is no taint of the possibility of wanting to show off. They're doing their scenes, they're doing their work behind the scenes, they're helping out orphans, they're building schools, they're doing charity work, they're specialized in Islamic science, for example. Whatever they're doing, as long as you're doing something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being productive and active, don't lose track if one field of specialization is not yours. There are many other fields of specialization as well.
وَلَوْ بَسَطَ اللَّهُ الرِّزْقَ لِعِبَادِهِ لَبَغَوْا فِي الْأَرْضِ ولكن ينزل بقدر ما يشاء إنه بعباده خبير بصير.
Allah Azza wa Jal says, if we had opened up the doors of our rizq, if we had given our sustenance to our servants, لَبَغَوْا فِي الْأَرْضِ, they would have gone beyond the measure. They would have gone to a level of haram. They would have done something that they should not do. وَلَكِنْ يُنَزِّلُ بِقَدَرٍ مَا يَشَاءُ. Instead, Allah reveals with qadr as much as He wants to whomever He pleases. Now this verse tells us a very interesting reality. Allah gives those whom He loves just enough for them to not go beyond the bounds. Allah is saying, I know how much you're capable of. And if I were to give you everything, then you would go beyond what is halal, what is permissible for you. And this same sentiment is demonstrated in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. In a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, it is narrated that the Prophet was giving someone money, or he was giving a group of people money. One of the Sahaba said, O Messenger of Allah, why don't you give so and so? For Wallah, he's a mu'min, he's a good guy, give it to him. And the Prophet ignored him. And he kept on giving to other people. Second time the Sahabi said, Ya Rasulullah, give to him, for Wallahi, I think he's a mu'min. And he ignored him for a second time. A third time he ignored him. And then our Prophet turned and said to him, Oh so and so, sometimes I give money to people and I don't give to those whom I love more. I.e. the beloved I don't give to, out of a fear that that money will be a temptation that will drag them into Jahannam. In other words, our Prophet knows the people. And he is saying, what you're saying about this man might be right. He's a mu'min, he's a good guy. But he doesn't have that type of, if you like, patience with money. That he might do something that is not appropriate with that money. And therefore, dear brothers and sisters, what we learn from this ayah and from this hadith is very simple. And that is, what we do not have, and we tried to get it, we didn't get it, we should be content that Allah has a plan. That Allah knows how much He's giving. وَلَكِنْ يُنَزِّلُ بِقَدَرٍ مَا يَشَاءُ. Allah reveals with His qadr as much as He pleases that person. In the end of the same surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the same fact, but this time about children. Allah says in the Quran, He is the one who blesses with children. يَهَبُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ إِنَاثٍ. To some He gives all daughters. وَيَهَبُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورِ. To some He gives all men, all boys. أَوْ يُزَوِّجُهُمْ ذُكْرَانًا وَإِنَاثًا. And some families, they have boys and girls. وَيَجْعَلُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ عَقِيمًا. And some people have no children. إِنَّهُ عَلِيٌّ قَدِيرٌ. This is the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah knows who to give what to. And Allah knows how much to give. And Allah knows who to test people with. And therefore the believer who believes in qadr, one of the main benefits of believing in qadr is that you feel a contentment of the heart. Whatever has happened because of qadr. As I said many times, qadr is used to calm down and to find release from a calamity. And qadr is not used to justify a sin. Qadr is used to find peace in whatever Allah has decreed. You didn't get the job, qaddar Allah. You didn't make the million that you were looking to get from the business, qaddar Allah. You didn't have this, you didn't get that. You tried, you made dua to Allah, you didn't get it. Now the point is you have to try. If you didn't try, that's your problem. But you have to try. You want the job, you want the business, you want to get married, you try. If it doesn't happen, that's when we say, qaddar Allah.
Many of you might not know that Muslims were the first to really manufacture paper at an international level. That Muslims were the one who spread paper to the entire globe, from India to Europe. But they didn't invent it. They perfected it and they popularized it. Where did it come from? In the Battle of Tal'as in 751 CE, which is in the 1st century of the Hijrah, under the caliphate of the early Abbasid dynasty, in the Battle of Tal'as, Muslims fought against a small group of what we now call Chinese nations. And paper had been invented by the Chinese. However, they didn't understand its significance. And it was something that only the elite did. It wasn't mass-produced, and the Chinese as a nation still used papyrus. Now papyrus is thick. Papyrus has to be folded up. Papyrus is very awkward to deal with. Paper, as we all know, is thin. Paper lasts forever. Papyrus only lasts for a few decades. The Chinese invented paper, but they kept it a state secret. They didn't want anybody to know about it. In the Battle of Tal'as, the Muslims captured 2 prisoners of war who were a part of this secret guild of paper manufacturers. New technology. What did they do? They embraced it. They understood the significance of this. So they took these 2 prisoners of war, treated them like royalty, brought them back to Baghdad, and the Khalifa said, you shall be free to leave back to China as soon as you teach us how to build paper, how to manufacture paper. So the Chinese taught the Muslims the art of paper manufacturing, and the first manufacturing mill in the entire Mediterranean world was set up in Samarkand. There was no paper in Europe at the time. There was no paper in India at the time. The first manufacturing mill was set up in Samarkand. And the Muslims experimented and they produced a better quality of paper. And eventually Baghdad, eventually Andalusia. The entire Muslim world produced different types of paper. Once upon a time there was Sulaimani paper, there was Dawoodi paper, there was Samarkandi paper. And by the way, the ancient Chinese, they used to call paper kaghaz. And us Pakistanis, we preserve the heritage and we still call paper to this day kaghaz. This term is ancient Chinese. So we still call paper kaghaz from the ancient Chinese to show you where it actually came from. Eventually the government, the Islamic government, adopted paper as its official means of communication. So paper spread throughout the Muslim land, from Andalusia on the one side, on the west, all the way through Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, all the way through Arabia, Damascus, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, all the way down to the borders of what is now China, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Paper became the norm, and with paper, what comes with paper? Books, education, universities, institutions, libraries, because paper is the medium of education. And it is not a coincidence that Islamic science has flourished, the writing of books flourished, scholarship flourished when paper was discovered. And with paper came, as I said, the largest universities in the world. The first universities and the largest libraries were Islamic libraries. And the fact of the matter is that Muslims were the have something that we now understand as being versatile. This is a braggadocio claim. It is a claim that has been documented by researchers. A famous scholar, George Makdisi, has an entire book called The Rise of Colleges in Islam. You can find it on Amazon. And in it, he documents the first colleges and the first universities were those produced by the Muslims. The notion of adults getting an education was something that Islam did. And of course, it's not a coincidence. All of this is happening with the medium of paper flourishing. The West eventually discovered paper. In the first crusade, in the second crusade, when they entered Jerusalem and they found the Muslims with paper, they brought it back to Europe. And Europeans, their appetite was whetted for paper. Where do we get paper from? And when they conquered Andalusia, they found the first paper printing presses they had ever seen in their lives. The first paper manufacturing mills. And this is an interesting fact of history. They expelled all the Muslims of Andalusia except for a handful who could teach them sciences they didn't know. And of those sciences they didn't know, how to make paper. So of the Muslims who were forced to remain were those who owned the paper manufacturing mills, those who knew the art of paper. And from Andalusia, Europeans acquired the art of making paper. And it spread throughout all of Europe until eventually they set up paper mills in Italy. And guess what? The Europeans started making better paper than the Muslims. For 200 years, paper was sold to Europe. Around 1500 or so, the Europeans began producing better paper. And from that point on, many of our manuscripts that we still find are actually being written on European paper. We see here the beginning of the rise and decline, the beginning of the fall. Paper is coming from Muslim lands to Europe, 1300, 1400. 1450, 1500, what happens? The Europeans discover better ways to make paper, better quality paper, stronger paper. So what happens? They begin selling to Muslims. You see the tides of change slowly coming along. And Europe excels in the art of manufacturing paper. Eventually, of course, paper also moves to India in the 13th century. Now, paper is always a sign of civilization and education. Not coincidentally, when paper flourishes in Europe, what happens? The rise of knowledge. The Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, all of this is happening around the same time that paper is being introduced to Europe. And Europeans have a surplus of paper. And when you have a surplus of a commodity, what happens? You've been thinking what to do with it. What can we do? How can we better utilize what we have in excess of? And therefore, not coincidentally, around 1450, who comes along? Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press. And the printing press is considered to be one of the most important technological advancements in the history of humanity, along with the wheel. Basically, number two is the printing press. Because with the printing press, what happens? Well, you can mass produce books. And with mass producing books, you are teaching a generation of people knowledge. They don't have to write an entire book by hand. Before the printing press, if you wanted to buy Tafsir ibn Kathir, if you wanted to purchase Sahih al-Bukhari, guess what? You had to sit down and write it cover to cover. Obviously, that's not easy to do, is it? With the printing press, you can mass produce thousands of books everybody reads. And with the printing press, education, technological advancements, everybody, Isaac Newton, his book on on nature and on science became an instant bestseller. And this is in the 1500s. When the average person is reading Newton, what happens? The bar is raised. Knowledge becomes an easy commodity. And when everybody's knowledgeable, the bar continues to rise. Now, we have the advent of the printing press. This is the second technological achievement we're going to talk about. When the printing press is introduced to Muslim lands, what happens now? This is where we see the alternative model. And that is the bubble. That is the shutting off. 600 years earlier, when paper was introduced, the Muslims embraced it. They Islamicized it. They made it part of their curriculum. Everything is written on paper after 750 CE. 150 Hijrah, everything is written on paper. Before 150 Hijrah, everything's written on papyrus and vellum and leather. After 150, everything is paper. They embraced it. Now what? The printing press is invented, 1450. Muslims hear of the printing press.
But now they have a 1,000-year history. Now they think that they know everything. Now they're not interested in change. So what happens? Many of you are not aware of this. When the Muslims first heard of the printing press, they banned it. They prohibited its importation into Muslim lands. They said this is something the kuffar have invented. We didn't invent it, it can't be good. And any printed book was banned. So much so that in 1485, the Ottoman said anybody who's discovered with a printing press or a book will be sent to jail. And the decree became even worse in 1515. Sultan Salim I said, anyone with an Arabic book that is printing press shall be executed. The punishment for owning a book printed was death. Why? There's a lot of reasons. My time does not allow me to go into all of them. But one reason, they did not want change. They wanted to somehow oppose modernity. They wanted to live in a shell because they were so confident our ways are the right ways. We are the right religion. We have the true teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. So we don't care if they invented paper or the printing press. We're not going to take it. It was enthusiasm was misdirected. Yes, we are the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. Yes, we are Muslims. But where does Allah tell us not to accept modernity? Where does Allah tell us don't accept technology? But there was a sense of supreme power. There was a sense of arrogance. There was also a fear of the printing press. Everybody's going to start reading. What's going to happen? There will become Sheikh Google and Mufti Wikipedia, as we're now scared of in the internet era, right? You ask Sheikh Google for your fatwas. There's a fear of change. So what did the Muslims do? They banned it. In the meantime, books are flourishing in European lands. Thousands and thousands of works. Not coincidentally, Martin Luther's Reformation utilizes the printing press. He prints the Bible in German for the people to read, because before this time, the church had banned the reading of the Bible. The Renaissance is coming right after this, challenging scriptures, interpretation that the earth is flat and the sun is going around the earth, and all of these changes that the church had put on the people. Scientists come along and challenges, Galileo and Newton and all of these people. Thinkers come along that change and challenge the political structure. What happens? The entire theocratic state, the entire dominion of the church collapsed completely, because education was too powerful and ignorance is bound to lose over education. So Europe was forced to change, and the church was forced to cut itself, and it became the Protestant and the Catholic, as you know, branches of Christianity. It is amazing, brothers and sisters, that throughout the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and even the early 1800s, printing presses were manufactured and transported, and books were printed across the world, except for lands of Islam. Can you believe that Hawaii and Tahiti in the 1830s had printing presses in their native languages, and you couldn't find a tafsir or a hadith or a Bukhari book printed in Egypt? Because it was haram, it was not right, it was, there was no such thing. The first person to bring a printing press to Egypt was Napoleon Bonaparte. When he invaded Egypt, he brought a printing press and he put it basically in the Muslim lands. It was forced upon the Muslims. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Egypt was cut away, as you know, by Muhammad Ali. So many changes came along. Eventually, the Muslims were forced to accept the printing press. And the first printing press was around 1840, 1850, 1860, around the Muslim world. And this is why if you go to any Islamic library, you're not going to find a printed book in Arabic in the 15, 16, 1700s. You'll find plenty of books in English, plenty of books in Latin, plenty of books in Swahili and in Hebrew and in the language of Hawaii. I don't know the language of Hawaii, whatever it is, but you'll find books printed in that language. But you won't find books printed in Arabic. Why? Because we were too scared of modernity. And we thought that if we allow the printing press in, it's going to corrupt the minds of our youth. But what happened? Eventually modernity was forced upon us because we were too scared to embrace it. And when that did happen, it was too late. Within a few decades, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. After that, the Sykes-Picot Agreement carved out the nations that we all know of the Ummah. We had one Ummah, now we have, mashallah, 60 members of the OIC. All of this came about. I'm not blaming entirely on the printing press, of course not, brothers and sisters, but I'm saying there's a mentality that is reflected. There's a mentality that is reflected that the Muslims were so confident of their cultural heritage that they mixed up religious glory with cultural glory. Yes, we're supposed to be proud we're Muslims. Of course we are. Yes, we're supposed to be thankful that Allah gave us the Quran and Sunnah. But where does the Quran and Sunnah oppose modernity and change? Yes, we're not going to change belief in Allah, but paper and the printing press? Come on. So the Muslims could not distinguish between that which should not change versus that which must change. There's a very powerful hadith that shows us the dangers of showing off. The dangers of showing off your good deeds to other people. And that is the hadith reported in Bukhari and Muslim, in which we learn that the very first people who will be called to task on the Day of Judgment, and the very first people who will be rewarded or punished on the Day of Judgment, will be the Hafidh of the Quran, the martyr, the shaheed, and the one who gave up his money all the time for the sake of Allah. These are the first three people whom Allah will call in front of Him. The memorizer, the Hafidh of the Quran, and the martyr who died in a legitimate expedition, and the charitable person. And as every they think Allah is on them, Allah is rewarding them, Allah will give them the first of Jannah. So Allah will ask this Hafidh, why did you memorize the Quran and why did you recite at these gatherings and at these masajid? Why did you go and do this? So the Hafidh will stand up with pride and he will say, oh Allah, I did it to bring honor to your book. I did it for the izzah of the religion, for the glory of the religion. I did it for your sake, oh Allah. And Allah will say, kadhabta, you're lying. And the angels will agree and say, you are lying. And the books will be brought forth and it will be clear that his intention, Allah will say, your intention was not to please me. You recited the Quran so that people would call you Qari, Hafiz, Sheikh. And they did. So get your reward from them. And then the second person, the martyr, the one who waged a legitimate expedition and he gave his life for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will be asked, why did you spend your life in the way of Allah? And the man will say, because I wanted to bring help to the religion. I wanted to bring i'la kalima, as we call, or bringing help to Islam, glory to Islam. I wanted to defend the religion, defend the weakless and the homeless and the poor. I did it for your sake, O Allah. And Allah will once again say, kadhabta, you're lying. And the angels will testify you're lying. And Allah will say, you only did it so that people could call you, mashallah, mujahid, mashallah, brave man, mashallah, you've done so much. And the people did. You got your reward from them, none from me. And the same with the third person, that he will say, I gave of money to be a generous person for your religion. And Allah will say, kadhabta, you're lying. And the angels will agree and say, you're lying. And Allah will say, you only did so that you could be known in the community, so that people would call you generous. And that is exactly what they did. You got your reward from them, none from me. And then Allah will punish these three in front of all of the creation, and they will be the very first people to enter the fire of hell, wal-iyadu billah. And Abu Hurairah was listening to this hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ tapped his knee and he said, Ya Abu Hurairah, these are the first three people who will taste the fire of hell. The Hafidh and Qari, and the one who is a shaheed, the martyr, and the third one is the one who is generous. Why? Because their intentions were not correct. They had this mixing of intentions. They wanted to show off their deeds. And imagine, brothers and sisters, imagine the fate of the person. He's doing good his whole life and he thinks he's going to meet Allah with all of this good. And then he is told, you didn't do it for my sake. You did it for your own ego. You did it to inflate your own prestige on the people. Why are you wanting me to reward you when you didn't do it purely for my sake?
Imagine the fate of that person. And therefore, brothers and sisters, we need to make sure we are not that person. We are not that person on the Day of Judgment who is told you wasted your whole life and all of your deeds will be thrown back at your face.
All of us as Muslims know the story of Isa speaking from his mother's cradle, from the hands of his mother. Most of us Muslims in this audience are not aware that this story is simply not found in the New Testament. It's not found. None of the Gospels of Matthew or Mark or Luke, none of them have. Also, all of us as Muslims know that the Quran mentions in 3 occasions the story of Isa and the birds blowing into it and they becoming real birds. Again, you will be surprised Muslims to know that this story is simply not mentioned in the canonical Christian Gospels. It's not found. And for the longest times, Christians would ridicule. Look at these Muslims, they have these weird and bizarre stories. Around 150 years ago, in Egypt, a interesting monastery was discovered in the desert, and in it there was the body of a monk from the 4th century CE. 4th century CE. And the body of this monk belonged to a sect of Christianity that was lost, it's gone. In the coffin there were scrolls, multiple scrolls, and these scrolls contained Gospels that are beyond the 4 canonical Gospels. Now, you should know that Constantine and others in 325 CE, they basically got rid of all of the other Gospels. There were lots of Gospels. And Constantine ordered these 4 to be chosen, and these 4 became the canonical, all the rest were destroyed. And to this day, most of them are destroyed. Once in a while we come across something from the ancient times. This was one of the most significant discoveries. One of these Gospels was the Gospel of St. Thomas. And it is now available on Amazon. You can Google the Gospel of St. Thomas. It was one of the lost Gospels. And in the Gospel of St. Thomas, we have both of these stories. The story of Jesus speaking as a baby, and the story of the birds becoming real birds. And it is amazing that for literally 13 centuries, these stories were not known to any Christian community. Any. They're only found in the Quran. And yet, and this is not, I'm giving you a concrete example, look it up. Go look, buy the book, the Gospel of St. Thomas. Purchase it, read it for yourself. And you find these 2 stories are not found in the actual canonical Gospels, and yet they are found in the Gospel of St. Thomas. And this is clearly a miracle of the Prophet ﷺ. And as Allah says in the Quran, you were not there, you didn't know it, your people did not know it, but Allah gave you this wahy.
Miracles that occurred with inanimate objects. Miracles of the Prophet that occurred with neither animals, nor food, nor drink, nor inanimate objects. Things that are basically rocks and stones and of this nature. And of these are so many. Of them is the famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ said, I still recognize a stone, a hijab, that used to say salam to me every time I pass by it in Makkah before prophethood. I still recognize that stone, used to say salam to me before my prophethood. And Ibn Mas'ud said that one time we heard the food that the Prophet ﷺ put in his mouth say the tasbih while we were sitting around him. Reported in Sahih al-Bukhari. The food saying subhanallah as it was put in the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ. And in one hadith, Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, the famous companion Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, narrated that I was in a gathering with Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and the Sahaba, and the Prophet took a group of pebbles in his hand, the gravel, and we all heard the stones praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet passed these stones to Abu Bakr, and they continued praising Allah in the hands of Abu Bakr. Then the Prophet took it back from Abu Bakr, gave it to Umar, and Umar, everybody heard in the audience the stones saying subhanallah. The Prophet then took it back, gave it to Uthman, and they continued praising, and we all heard. All of us heard. Then after the Prophet left, and we took those stones, nobody could hear anything coming from them. So, and this hadith is reported in At-Tabarani's Al-Awsat. Now, the point here is that, subhanallah, the Prophet ﷺ had picked those stones up, and they're praising Allah. And it is as if, by picking up the stones, the praise that is already emanating, because everything praises Allah. وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِحَهُم. There is nothing except that it praises Allah, but you don't hear it. You don't understand it. It is as if when He ﷺ touched those stones, all of a sudden the barrier between us and those rocks was lifted. And we could hear, or those in the audience could hear, what the stones are always doing. And when He gave it to Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman, that barrier was continued to be lifted. Then when He left ﷺ and the stones put down, everybody else is picking them up, and the barrier has now returned back to where it is. And it is narrated in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad that once the Prophet ﷺ was giving da'wah to one of the leaders of the tribes of Amir ibn Sa'sa'a, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Do you want to see an ayah, a miracle?" He said, "Yes." So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Look at that grove of date palms and call out that small tree to come." So the tribal chieftain said, "Oh trunk of the tree," or it's a baby palm tree, it's not fully grown, "Oh baby palm tree, come." And the Sahabi says the tree came crawling all the way until it stood in front of the chieftain. Then the Prophet said, "Irji', go back." And the tree went back until it resumed its original post, and the chieftain converted to Islam on the spot, and he said, "I shall never disbelieve in anything that comes from your mouth after this." Reported in Musnad Imam Ahmad. And this shows us the purpose of a miracle. This man was ambivalent. This man was open-minded. He was shown a miracle, he converts on the spot. The leaders of Quraysh, doesn't matter what you would have done, they would never have converted. And of course, perhaps the most famous in this category of inanimate objects, perhaps the most famous incident is the trunk of the tree. The trunk of the tree of the Prophet ﷺ, the entire masjid is jam-packed. Over 1,000 people could fit in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, right? We have 1,000 witnesses that the Prophet ﷺ, when the masjid was initially built, so they had to cut down some stumps of the tree so that the masjid could be empty, and they left one of the stumps right in the front so that the Prophet ﷺ could give the khutbah on it. This was in the first year of the Hijrah. By the time some wealth began to pour in, the third year of the Prophet ﷺ, the fourth year of the Hijrah, so somebody said, "Oh Messenger of Allah, why don't we make for you a custom-made pulpit, a proper pulpit? Let's carve it out and put, 3 steps in it. We'll do a proper pulpit." So he said, "Okay, if you want to do it." So one of the ladies of the Ansar, she had a servant who had trained in the art of carpentry. Carpentry was not that common in Mecca and Medina. This is a trade. So she had a servant who was the most famous carpenter. So he was commissioned to build a pulpit, and so the pulpit was now moved to the middle of the masjid. Before this time, the pulpit was towards one of the sides, because you cannot decide where the tree is. It just happened to be there. So the pulpit was towards the side. So now the pulpit is moved in the middle, and the very first day that he's giving the khutbah, the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. It is reported by many Sahaba. This is mutawatir, over 1,000 eyewitnesses. What happens? The Sahaba said, "We began hearing a noise like the crying of a baby camel." Loud noises coming, like the crying of a baby camel. And the Prophet ﷺ interrupted the khutbah, and he came down from the mimbar, and he hugged the tree and patted it until it stopped crying. It's sobbing, and he patted it until it stopped crying. And then he said, in one version it is said, that if I had not patted it and stopped it, it would have continued crying until the day of judgment. And he then commanded that the tree be uprooted and dug and put underneath his mimbar, where it is to this day. To this day, underneath where the Imam gives the khutbah, underneath that somewhere is that tree. Whenever Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, the famous tabi'i, would recite this hadith, he would begin to cry. And he would say, "A tree cried because it missed the Prophet ﷺ and the knowledge that the Prophet ﷺ spread. How about us and our hearts? Should we not cry as well for not having had the opportunity to hear our Prophet ﷺ?"
Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about myself? And why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about you? Or why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about us in front of the angels? Now this is a question that the Mufassirun, they raise in the Kitab Tafasir, in the books of the commentaries of the Quran. And they answer really beautifully. They say that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended to create myself, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended to create you, or more precisely and specifically Adam alayhi salatu wasalam, the Malaika had a problem. And they said, why do you want to create to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala certain creatures that will cause mischief and bloodshed on the world? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then ends the discussion by saying that what I know you do not know. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went on and He created Adam alayhi salatu wasalam, and from his progeny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. So when we sit as human beings, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we sit to think about our position, when we think and we start pondering and taking stock of our life, that how close have we been or got to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if it, Allah save us, be the other way, how far are we away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we sit and do that exact a'mal, that particular action, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that to prove the angels, the malaika wrong. That you said that these creatures are going to cause mischief and bloodshed. Here they are remembering me in the masjid. And that is why in this particular hadith of dhikr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that the third benefit of a gathering of dhikr is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks highly about those people that are participating in the gathering of dhikr in front of the malaika.
Advice to the parents. The parents now, realize that Allah Azza wa Jal has given you a role. That role is not to be a dictator. That role is not to control each and every matter of the lives of your children, but that role is that of murabbi. That role is that of a nourisher. And that nourishment will be a lot when it's a seedling. And as the seedling grows, that nourishment will minimize. This is what your role is. So don't think short term, think long term. Think what's going to happen to this child 15, 20 years down the line if I treat him in this manner versus that manner. Don't think short term, think long term. Remember that your child might go ways and do things you don't like, but in the long run, you want your child to have this perception, I can always go back to my mother and father no matter what I do. You don't want your child to, as soon as they're independent, leave the house. And that's what's happening. A number of households, we know this. I know places where as soon as the kids found a job, because the home environment was so stifling, they hated it so much, they just disappeared. Realize that thinking long term will save you in this regard. Your role is to provide an atmosphere of love, an atmosphere of comfort. No doubt you will be strict at times, but think long term even when it comes to the strictness.